One deadline passed, and the league didn't blink. That's the part people can't stop talking about, because in most sports, when a collective bargaining deadline hits midnight, you expect fireworks. Headlines, emergency pressers, somebody panicking. Instead, what happened in the WNBA felt colder than that. Like both sides stared at the clock, watched it hit zero, and then just kept walking. And now the internet is doing what it always does in a vacuum. It's official. Goodbye forever. WNBA dissolved. Except, that's not what happened. Not even close. But here's the twist. This is still the most dangerous game of chicken the league has ever played. Because even if the league didn't end overnight, the damage doesn't need a dramatic announcement to become real. It can happen quietly. In scheduling offices. In sponsor meetings. In arena calendars. In TV partner conversations that never go public. And once that chain reaction starts, it doesn't matter who won the press conference war. So let's break down what's actually happening, what the deadline meant, why the status quo period scares people, why the league dissolved rumor keeps spreading, and what both sides are really gambling with right now. Because if you think this is just a fight about money, you're missing the real pressure point. And it's way uglier than most fans want to admit. First, that midnight moment didn't magically shut the WNBA down. What it did do was push the league into what's being called a status quo period. And the reason that phrase matters is simple. It's limbo. The old rules can still function in certain ways, but the future becomes harder to plan the longer this drags. And the league is built on planning. Schedules don't appear out of thin air. Arena dates don't pause, out of respect for negotiations. Sponsors don't keep writing checks if they don't know what they're buying. And TV partners don't love uncertainty, especially not when they're already mapping out programming months in advance. So no, the league didn't dissolve. But yes, the clock became louder. Because now, every single day without a deal quietly creates more friction. And the scary part? That friction doesn't show up as one big disaster. It shows up as 1,000 small problems that stack until somebody finally says, "This is getting unmanageable." And once you hit that point, the negotiation isn't just about salaries anymore. It becomes about survival momentum. And that's where this gets toxic. Because the public thinks this is a simple morality play. Greedy owners versus underpaid players. But the people inside the business see a different story. They see risk. And risk changes everything. Which brings us to the part the league and the union both understand. Even if they'll never say it the same way. Here's the part that decides these negotiations before the contract language ever does. Optics. Not who's right. Not who deserves what. Who looks reasonable and who looks reckless. Because most fans aren't reading term sheets. They're reading vibes. And in modern sports labor disputes, vibes are currency. The side that looks calmer, more professional, more controlled usually wins the crowd. And once the crowd tilts, everything tilts with it. Media coverage, sponsor comfort, even internal pressure inside locker rooms. That's why this moment is so dangerous for the Players Association specifically. The public sympathy that should automatically lean toward labor isn't staying locked in. At first, a lot of fans hear CBA fight and assume the same script they've seen before. Players underpaid, owners rich, players finally standing up. That's a clean story. It's easy to pick a side. But then the messaging starts. And messaging is where things can go sideways fast. Because when one side speaks like a business and the other speaks like a movement, you don't just get disagreement, you get culture clash. And that culture clash is exactly what turns a negotiation into a referendum on personality. When fans see statements packed with charged language, words like non-negotiable, regressive, harm, running out the clock, some people interpret that as strength. But a big chunk of the audience hears it as performative. Like the statement wasn't written to close a deal, it was written to win a social media battle. And the moment fans start thinking you care more about being right than being effective, their sympathy starts leaking. Slowly at first, then all at once. Because here's what happens psychologically. If fans believe both sides are greedy, they don't side with labor anymore. They side with who looks like they're trying to keep the season alive. And that is a nightmare for a union. It's not supposed to play out like that. But that's what happens when the league is still fighting for mainstream stability and is dependent on momentum. In older, richer leagues, fans can stomach a messy labor fight because the sport is a permanent habit. In a league still converting new viewers into lifers, the tolerance is way lower. Casual fans don't follow labor disputes. They bail. And the league knows that. Sponsors know that. TV partners know that. This is why optics matter more here than almost anywhere else. Because in the WNBA, perception isn't just PR. It's literally part of the business model right now. You can't sell growth while trending for shutdown. You can't sell stability while your biggest headlines are strike talk. And if you think that only affects rich people in boardrooms, you're missing the trickle-down. When perception turns, it hits the league in 4 places at once. First, media coverage. Networks don't want complicated. They want clean narratives. They want highlights, stars, and storylines that end with, and here's what happened next. Labor fights don't end cleanly. They stretch. They confuse casual viewers. They create negative comments and political noise. So the coverage shrinks. Not because it's a conspiracy, because it's bad TV. And when coverage shrinks, the league's cultural moment starts evaporating. Second, sponsors. Sponsors don't buy basketball. They buy association. They buy vibes. They buy brand safety. If the conversation around the league becomes chaos, instability, and no season, sponsors get nervous. Even if the games eventually happen, sponsors hate the idea of paying for something that might not deliver. A sponsor doesn't want to explain to their boss why they bought inventory that didn't exist. So the moment uncertainty rises, the sponsor pressure starts behind the scenes. Quiet emails. Just checking on timelines. Any clarity yet? Do we need to adjust deliverables? That's how confidence dies, politely. Third, players internally. This is the part most people don't talk about. Public sentiment doesn't just live on social media. Players see it. Their families see it. Their agents see it. They hear boos. They read the comments. They notice when the tone changes from "pay them" to "this is getting DMN ridiculous." And once that sentiment flips, unity becomes harder to maintain. Because solidarity is easier when the world is cheering you on. It gets complicated when the world starts blaming you. That's when the union leadership has to work overtime to keep members locked in, especially the middle-tier players who aren't living on endorsements and brand deals. Fourth, the league's negotiating position. Public pressure can create political pressure, and political pressure can push owners to compromise. That's the theory unions often rely on in leagues where fans are deeply invested. But in a league where a large portion of fans are newer and not emotionally tied yet, public pressure doesn't automatically materialize. Instead, public pressure can hit the union. And that's the inversion that makes this situation so volatile. A labor dispute where fans start siding with management, even temporarily, changes the leverage math. Now let's go even deeper, because the optics war isn't happening by accident. Both sides are consciously choosing a style. The league wants to sound calm, corporate, adult in the room. They want short statements, controlled tone. We care about sustainability. We're committed to growth. We want to increase salaries but keep things stable. That messaging is designed for one audience more than any other. Not fans, partners, investors, networks, people with money who hate uncertainty. The union, meanwhile, is trying to play 2 games at once. Win the negotiation and win the moral argument in the public square. That can work, but only if the public square is already on your side. And here's the risk. When you moralize a business negotiation, you're implicitly telling anyone who questions you that they're not just disagreeing, they're wrong as a person. That's where backlash comes from. Because casual sports fans aren't trying to be lectured. They're trying to be entertained. They want games. They want storylines. They want players to be paid, sure, but they don't want to feel like they're being drafted into a culture war just to watch a Thursday night matchup. So when statements start sounding like activism, casual fans don't analyze the nuance. They just emotionally detach. And detachment is deadly. Especially right now. Because the WNBA's biggest asset isn't just talent, it's attention. And attention doesn't stay loyal in silence. It needs constant feeding, highlights, rivalries, moments, availability, story arcs. That's why people keep saying the league is one injury away from losing momentum. Not because the entire league is one person, but because the recent surge of mainstream attention is fragile. And fragility makes optics feel existential. So when you see WNBA dissolved thumbnails, it's not just clickbait. It's tapping into the fear that the league's moment can be lost if the league looks unstable for too long. Now, here's the part that most fans miss. Optics doesn't only affect fans. It affects decision-makers. And decision-makers don't like being embarrassed. If a negotiation makes the league look messy, it makes the partners look messy, and partners don't want their brand tied to a mess. That pressure filters back to the league office. That pressure filters to ownership groups. That pressure turns into, we need resolution. But it can also turn into something more cynical. We can wait. The other side will take the heat. Because once the union becomes the face of the chaos, the owners can posture as the stabilizers. And stabilizers always sound good to people who fund the league. That's why the optics war matters so much. It's not just who says the meaner line. It's who gets believed when they say, we're trying to save the season. And the scariest part? You can lose the optics war in a single moment. One statement that reads arrogant. One protest that looks childish. One viral clip that makes people say, come on, really? Because fans don't measure fairness carefully. They measure tone. And once tone becomes the story, the negotiation becomes emotional theater. Which is exactly where things can spiral. Because now the league isn't just negotiating a CBA. It's negotiating public patience. And public patience is the rarest resource in sports. But that still isn't the whole story. Because even if the union wins the moral argument online, the owners have a weapon that beats morality in negotiations every time. And it's not PR. It's time. If Part 2 was about optics, Part 3 is about leverage that never makes headlines. Because while fans argue online and statements get dissected word by word, the owners are playing a much colder game. They're playing the clock. And time is the most ruthless negotiator in professional sports. Here's the key thing most people misunderstand. The owners don't need to win loudly. They just need to wait. They don't need press conferences. They don't need threats. They don't even need to escalate. They just need to let reality apply pressure naturally. And that pressure doesn't hit everyone equally. It hits players first. Not emotionally, logistically, financially, structurally. Because while the league can afford uncertainty, individual players often can't. Let's start with the biggest invisible lever, arena calendars. WNBA teams don't own most of their buildings. They rent them. Many share them with NBA teams, NHL teams, concerts, conventions, college events, and corporate showcases. Those calendars are locked months, sometimes years, in advance. And here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. If you don't have a confirmed season schedule, you don't own your dates. You're borrowing them. So when a CBA stalls, arena operators don't wait politely. They start reallocating. A concert promoter comes in with guaranteed money and a fixed tour date. That date is gone. A UFC event wants a Saturday night? Gone. A major touring artist wants a week-long run? Gone. And once those dates are gone, they don't magically come back. Now multiply that across the league. That's why the owners don't panic publicly. They don't need to. The calendar does the work for them. Every week without a deal quietly reduces flexibility. Not for the owners, for the league operations team. And when operations start panicking, pressure flows upward. Now let's talk about the second clock that's ticking, player finances. This is where reality hits hard. Most WNBA players are not living on massive endorsement safety nets. A handful are. The rest rely on salary, overseas play, off-season work, and careful financial planning. A delayed season doesn't just mean, wait a little longer. It means missed paychecks, delayed bonuses, uncertainty about overseas contracts, disrupted training schedules, risk of injury without income protection. And that stress doesn't hit equally. Veterans nearing the end of their careers feel it differently than rookies. Players with families feel it differently than players without dependents. Fringe roster players feel it differently than stars. This is why time fractures unity. Because the longer negotiations drag, the more uneven the pain becomes. At first, everyone can hold the line. Then someone quietly starts asking their agent questions. What happens if this goes another month? What if games get canceled? What if this hurts my next contract? Those conversations don't happen in press releases. They happen at kitchen tables. That's when solidarity gets tested. Now layer in career timelines. This part matters more than people admit. WNBA careers are short. Windows are narrow. Peak years aren't guaranteed. Injuries happen. Roster spots disappear fast. If you're a player entering what might be your prime, every lost season is a season you don't get back. Owners don't age out of ownership. Players age out of leagues. That asymmetry is brutal, and everyone in the room knows it, even if they don't say it. Now let's add the third clock, media cycles. Attention doesn't wait. When there's no product, media doesn't hover patiently. It moves on. The NBA has games. The NFL has storylines. College sports never stop. Soccer fills the gaps. If the WNBA isn't playing, it isn't discussed. And silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like regression. The longer the league is quiet, the easier it is for casual fans to forget the momentum even existed. That's why delayed seasons hurt leagues more than canceled ones sometimes. A cancellation is dramatic. A delay is forgettable. And forgettable is poison. Owners know that if this drags on too long, public pressure doesn't necessarily explode. It fades. And faded attention weakens the union's leverage. Now here's the coldest part of the strategy. The owners don't need to threaten a lockout to force concessions. They just let consequences stack. They let arena conflicts pile up. They let scheduling complications grow. They let sponsors get nervous. They let players feel financial anxiety. And eventually someone blinks. Not because they were wrong. Because the cost of waiting became too high. That's why this isn't a dramatic showdown with a final bell. It's a slow squeeze. And the squeeze is asymmetrical. Owners lose potential revenue. Players lose time they can't replace. That's why history almost always favors management in prolonged labor standoffs, especially in leagues without massive guaranteed revenue streams. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable. The league doesn't actually need every player to end the standoff. They need enough players. Because once a critical mass wants resolution, pressure turns internal. That's when cracks form. Not publicly. Privately. That's when union leadership has to work harder to keep everyone aligned. That's when players start asking, are we sure this is the hill? That's when compromise becomes more attractive. Not because demands changed, but because time changed the cost-benefit equation. And that's why time is the owner's favorite weapon. It doesn't look aggressive. It doesn't create backlash. It doesn't trend on social media. It just works. Quietly. Relentlessly. And the scariest part? Once time pressure reaches a certain point, the outcome doesn't depend on who's right anymore. It depends on who can endure discomfort longer. That's the moment when negotiations stop being about fairness and start being about survival. But even time isn't the most dangerous variable in this entire standoff. Because there's one factor that makes every delay feel existential for the league, and it has nothing to do with contracts. It has to do with concentration of value. And once you understand that, the fear driving both sides suddenly makes sense. This is the part of the conversation that makes everyone uneasy. Because once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. And it explains why this CBA fight feels less like negotiation and more like a cliff edge. Here's the hard truth the league, the union, and even the fans quietly understand. The WNBA's current value is concentrated, not distributed. That doesn't mean the other players aren't talented. It doesn't mean they aren't important. It doesn't mean they don't deserve respect or fair pay. It means from a business standpoint, attention flows through a very small number of names. And that reality shapes every single decision happening behind closed doors right now. Let's be blunt. There are maybe 6 or 7 players whose individual presence meaningfully moves ratings, ticket sales, sponsorship interest, and media coverage on their own. You already know the names. They're the players casual fans recognize instantly. The players' networks build storylines around. The players' sponsors feel comfortable attaching money to. Everyone else matters to the game, but not equally to the business. That distinction is brutal, but it's real. And it creates a massive power imbalance that neither side wants to say out loud. Because the moment you acknowledge it, the entire negotiation changes. Here's why. The union negotiates as a collective, but the market responds to individuals. That tension is the core problem. When the Players Association argues for revenue sharing, they're framing the league as a unified value generator. But the league office and the owners see something different. They see a pyramid. At the top, a few stars driving disproportionate attention. In the middle, solid contributors who benefit from association. At the base, replaceable labor from a business perspective. Again, that's not a moral judgment. It's how sports economics work when a league is still stabilizing. Now here's where it gets dangerous. If the league shuts down, or even stumbles badly, those top stars will still have options. They have endorsements. They have global visibility. They have leverage. Everyone else doesn't. That's why the risk of a prolonged standoff isn't evenly shared. The stars can survive turbulence. The middle and bottom of the roster absorb the damage. And everyone knows it. That's why management feels confident holding firm. Because even in worst-case scenarios, the most valuable assets remain marketable. Now flip that perspective. From the union's side, this concentration of value creates a nightmare. Because unity only works when incentives align. And right now, incentives are diverging. A player fighting for long-term structural change might be willing to endure short-term pain. A player fighting to stay in the league another 2 seasons might not. A player with endorsements and visibility might support a hard line. A player relying on salary to pay rent might quietly hope this ends soon. Those differences don't make anyone selfish. They make them human. And the longer this drags on, the harder it becomes to pretend everyone's incentives are identical. This is why star power becomes radioactive in negotiations. Because once you admit that the league's value isn't evenly distributed, you open the door to uncomfortable questions. Should compensation be tied more directly to revenue generation? Should stars carry more leverage than role players? Should the union protect the median player or maximize the top end? There are no clean answers. But ignoring the questions doesn't make them disappear. Now add one more layer: fragility. When value is concentrated, systems become fragile. If one key player gets hurt, retires, or leaves the spotlight, the ripple effects are immediate. Sponsors hesitate. Media attention softens. Narratives slow down. That's why people keep mentioning injuries, not out of fear-mongering, but because it's structurally relevant. A league built on momentum needs continuity. And continuity depends heavily on a small number of players staying healthy and visible. That reality terrifies owners and players alike. Owners fear building long-term financial commitments on a narrow base. Players fear being blamed, fairly or unfairly, for consequences beyond their control. So both sides dig in, not because they're confident, but because they're scared, and fear makes negotiations rigid. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about publicly. If the league collapses, the stars will still be remembered. The others will be forgotten. History preserves icons. It forgets role players. That's not fair, but it's true. And that truth quietly shapes how much risk different players are willing to tolerate. This is why the league feels like it's balancing on a knife edge. Because when value is concentrated and unity is required, the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. One fracture, one defection, one miscalculation, and the entire structure wobbles. That's why statements have gotten sharper. That's why patience is wearing thin. That's why this doesn't feel like a normal labor dispute. It feels existential. Because it is. And the most unsettling part? Everyone involved knows the league can't afford to lose its stars. But the league also can't afford to admit just how dependent it is on them. That contradiction sits at the heart of this entire crisis. And it leads directly into the next question nobody wants to ask. What happens if unity breaks? Not officially, but quietly. Because collapse doesn't always start with an announcement. Sometimes it starts with silence. And once that silence spreads, there's no press release that can stop it. If this situation does unravel, it won't happen the way most people expect. There won't be a dramatic press conference. There won't be a single moment everyone points to and says, "That's when it ended." Because leagues like this don't collapse loudly. They collapse quietly. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Here's the truth most fans don't see yet. Unity rarely breaks in public. It breaks in private. Long before headlines change, behavior does. And the signs are subtle. It starts with conversations that never make it to social media. Phone calls that aren't tweeted. Agents asking questions they didn't ask before. Not because players are betraying each other, but because reality starts intruding. Imagine you're a mid-rotation player. You're not a star. You're not invisible. You're somewhere in between. You've got a short career window. You've got an overseas option, but it's not guaranteed. You've got bills that don't pause for labor disputes. Publicly, you support the union. Privately, you're doing math. How long can this last? What happens if games are missed? What happens if the league shrinks? Those questions don't make you weak. They make you rational. Now imagine you're an agent representing 5 players. 1 is a household name. 2 are solid contributors. 2 are fighting for roster spots. Your job isn't ideology. Your job is protecting careers. So you start planning contingencies. Not publicly. Not loudly. Just quietly. You ask about overseas interest. You ask about endorsement protections. You ask about exit clauses and timing. That's how fractures begin. Not with rebellion. With preparation. This is the phase where leadership feels unity, but doesn't realize it's thinning. Because everyone still shows up to meetings. Everyone still uses the same language. Everyone still posts solidarity messages. But behind the scenes, people are hedging. And hedging is irreversible. Once a player starts planning for a future where the league might pause, shrink, or fold, their risk tolerance changes forever. They stop thinking in terms of we. They start thinking in terms of me, surviving this. That shift doesn't require anyone to defect publicly. It just requires time. And time is the one thing this situation does not have. Here's another uncomfortable layer. Owners don't need everyone to break. They only need enough. Enough players willing to accept a deal. Enough pressure on leadership. Enough doubt that unity starts to wobble. Because once doubt exists, leverage evaporates. That's why owners are patient. They don't need to win loudly. They just need to wait. Every week without games increases personal financial anxiety. Every delayed paycheck changes someone's calculus. Every uncertain update chips away at resolve. And the scariest part? Nobody has to announce that shift. It happens silently. This is how previous leagues failed, not because demands were wrong, but because timelines were misjudged. Leadership assumes unity will hold longer than it actually can, and by the time they realize it's slipping, it's already gone. Now let's talk about stars again, because this matters. Star players don't defect first. They wait. They observe. They let others blink. And that creates a cascading effect. Because when non-stars start quietly exploring alternatives, stars notice. And when stars notice, they stop risking everything on collective outcomes. They start protecting legacy, brand, longevity, optionality. That doesn't mean crossing picket lines. It means staying silent when silence benefits them. And silence is powerful. Silence creates ambiguity. Ambiguity creates pressure. Pressure breaks systems. This is why the most dangerous phase of a labor dispute is not the beginning. It's the middle, when nobody knows who's still fully in. When leadership has to assume loyalty instead of confirming it. When patience turns into anxiety. And anxiety turns into cracks. Now add one final accelerant. Public opinion. Right now, casual fans are confused. They're not marching. They're not choosing sides. They're waiting. But waiting doesn't last forever. If games don't happen, fans don't get angrier, they drift. They find other stories, other leagues, other moments. And once attention leaves, it doesn't rush back. That's the silent killer. Not backlash. Absence. Leagues don't die because fans are mad. They die because fans stop caring. And that's the ticking clock nobody can pause. So when people ask, who blinks first, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is, who realizes too late that blinking already started? Because once quiet exits, contingency plans, and private doubts reach critical mass, no public statement can restore leverage. The negotiation ends, not with a deal, but with inevitability. And in the next part, we need to confront the most uncomfortable scenario of all. What actually happens if games are missed, and why the consequences are far worse than most people realize. That's where theory meets reality, and where good intentions stop matching. Here's the line nobody wants to cross. Not publicly, not emotionally, not even in private conversations. Missing games. Because once that happens, this stops being a negotiation and starts becoming damage control. Up to this point, everything exists in theory. Statements, deadlines, posturing, leaks. All of it still assumes one thing remains intact. That basketball will eventually be played. The second a real game disappears from the calendar, the entire ecosystem reacts at once. And not in ways the public usually imagines. The first hit doesn't land on players or owners. It lands on partners. Sponsors don't argue ideology. They argue contracts. They don't care who's right. They care whether inventory exists. No games means no ads. No activations. No guaranteed exposure. The moment games are missed, those partners start asking for make goods or refunds. Quietly at first. Firmly after. And here's the key detail most fans miss. Those losses don't magically come back when games resume. They're gone. Next comes media. Television partners don't just lose content, they lose confidence. Schedules get reshuffled. Windows get reassigned. Replacement programming fills the gap. And once something else works in that time slot, it doesn't politely step aside later. Networks remember reliability. They also remember risk. A league that can't guarantee games becomes a bargaining liability the next time contracts are discussed. Even if play resumes, leverage doesn't. Then comes the most misunderstood group of all. Casual fans. Not diehards. Not social media power users. The millions who tuned in because it felt new, exciting, and alive. Those fans don't follow labor disputes. They don't read statements. They just notice absence. They open an app. There's no game. They move on. And here's the part that never gets recovered. Momentum is emotional, not logical. Once a casual fan emotionally detaches, it takes a massive moment to pull them back. Not a press release. Not a tweet. Not even a settlement. A moment. And moments can't be scheduled. Now let's talk numbers, not hypotheticals. Missing even a handful of games reduces projected revenue. Reduced revenue shrinks future salary structures, which means the very thing players are fighting for starts slipping away in real time. That's the paradox. The longer the dispute lasts, the smaller the pie becomes. So every extra day without games increases the gap between what players want and what the league can actually afford. That's not leverage. That's erosion. Now zoom in on individual players again, because this is where things get personal. For stars, missing games hurts legacy. For non-stars, it hurts survival. A missed season doesn't just mean lost income. It means lost film, lost development, lost visibility. Overseas leagues don't wait. They move on. Rosters fill. Opportunities close. And when players return, the market doesn't reset, it contracts. That's how careers quietly shorten. Now add expansion teams to the mix. Expansion relies on optimism. Investors want growth stories, not instability. Missed games slow expansion timelines. Delayed expansion reduces roster spots. Fewer roster spots increase competition, which again squeezes the middle and bottom of the league hardest. This is where reality becomes unavoidable. Owners can absorb losses. Players absorb consequences. That doesn't make owners right. It just makes the math brutal. And here's the part almost nobody wants to say out loud. Once games are missed, someone has to be blamed. Narratives harden. Media frames the story. Public sympathy shifts. And once that shift happens, even a deal feels like defeat. Because instead of celebrating progress, everyone argues about damage. That's why the most dangerous moment isn't the strike announcement. It's the first empty night where a game should have been played, and wasn't. No crowd. No highlights. No noise. Just absence. Absence is irreversible. You can resume play. You can't rewind trust. So when people say, they can always fix this later, they're misunderstanding how fragile momentum actually is. Leagues don't bounce back automatically. They rebuild if they survive. And that brings us to the hardest question yet. What happens if the league technically survives, but never fully recovers? Because collapse doesn't always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means shrinking into something smaller, quieter, and less relevant than before. And once that happens, no negotiation can undo it. That's what we need to talk about next. The future that exists between survival and success, and why it might be the most likely outcome of all. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people aren't ready to hear. The WNBA doesn't have to collapse to lose. It just has to survive smaller. Because survival is not success. And stability is not growth. That distinction is everything right now. If this dispute ends with a deal that technically keeps the league alive, but strips away momentum, the damage won't be loud. It'll be quiet, slow, almost invisible at first. This is how leagues actually decline. Not with press conferences, not with dramatic farewells, but with subtle downgrades no one wants to admit are happening. Start with visibility. If games are missed, even briefly, networks don't punish the league out of spite, they adjust out of caution. Fewer prime slots. More off windows. Less promotion. Not because they don't care, but because they can't justify the risk. And once visibility drops, everything downstream follows. Sponsors renegotiate at lower tiers. Marketing budgets shrink. Activation disappears, which means fewer casual eyes. Now look at the roster side. A surviving league starts protecting cost certainty. Shorter contracts. More non-guarantees. Less patience for development. You don't invest in long-term growth when you're unsure about short-term stability. That hurts younger players first. Then veterans. Then the pipeline. Now zoom out even further. Expansion becomes symbolic instead of ambitious. Cities still want teams, but ownership groups hesitate. Why rush into a league that just proved it can freeze itself? Expansion slows. Opportunities flatten. Roster spots don't grow at the pace promised. And suddenly the dream narrows. Not gone, but thinner. This is the version of the future nobody on either side is actually negotiating for. Players aren't fighting for a league that survives but stalls. Owners aren't investing to preside over mediocrity. But if both sides miscalculate, that's exactly what they get. Now let's talk about fans, because this part is critical. Hardcore fans stay. They always do. But the 2024 surge wasn't built on hardcores. It was built on curiosity. Curiosity is fragile. It doesn't argue. It doesn't protest. It doesn't defend. It just disappears. And once curiosity leaves, it doesn't come back unless something bigger replaces it. That's why the danger here isn't anger. It's indifference. A surviving league with declining relevance is far harder to rebuild than a league that fails fast and resets. Because at least collapse creates urgency. Stagnation creates complacency. And here's the hardest part for everyone involved. No one gets to declare victory in that outcome. Players don't get the system they wanted. Owners don't get the growth they projected. Fans don't get the product they were promised. Everyone technically wins the negotiation and loses the future. This is why the framing of this dispute matters so much. It's not players versus owners. It's timing versus patience. The league is early in its boom, not mature in it. The leverage exists, but it's fragile. And fragile leverage can disappear faster than it appears. Which brings us to the most important realization of all. This moment isn't about who deserves more. It's about who understands where the league actually is, not where everyone wants it to be. And that's where the conversation gets dangerous. Because if both sides are negotiating as if the WNBA already operates like the NBA, they're negotiating with imaginary money and imaginary leverage. Next, we need to talk about the biggest misconception driving this entire conflict. The idea that this boom is guaranteed. Because if that belief is wrong, even slightly, everything changes. Here's the truth that sits underneath everything we've talked about. The WNBA's boom is real, but it is not permanent yet. And that distinction changes everything. What happened in 2024 wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of one. That matters because early booms don't behave like established empires. They don't absorb shocks well. They don't bounce back automatically. They don't forgive mistakes just because intentions were good. They require protection. Right now, too many people are talking as if the league has already arrived, when in reality, it's still proving it can stay. This surge in attention didn't come from decades of habit. It came from moments, from storylines, from personalities, from timing lining up perfectly. That kind of attention can grow into loyalty, but only if it's nurtured carefully. And this is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because when both sides negotiate, as if the audience is locked in no matter what, they stop prioritizing the one thing that actually sustains growth: continuity. Fans don't need perfection. They need consistency. They need to know the games will be there. The stars will be there. The season will happen. Once doubt enters that equation, casual viewers don't wait around to see how it resolves. They move on. And history shows this clearly. Leagues don't disappear because one bad decision was made. They fade because several almost fine decisions pile up. A delayed season here. A canceled slate there. A public labor fight that overshadows the sport itself. Each one chips away at belief. Now zoom back in on the players. They're not wrong to demand more. They created real value. They deserve a larger share of it. But value has to be realized before it can be distributed. If the infrastructure collapses under the weight of expectation, there's nothing left to divide. Owners, on the other hand, aren't villains either. They're trying to stabilize a business that still relies on optimism as much as profit. But playing defense forever also kills momentum. Underinvesting during a growth window can be just as fatal as overreaching. That's why this moment is so precarious. Both sides are right in isolation. Both sides are wrong if they ignore timing. This league doesn't need a winner and a loser right now. It needs alignment. Because if this negotiation ends in ego, posturing, or miscalculation, the cost won't show up immediately. It'll show up 2 seasons from now. In smaller crowds. In quieter coverage. In fewer kids choosing this path. And by then, it'll be too late to trace the damage back to this moment. The scary part? Everyone involved will swear they were acting rationally. That's how fragile eras end. Not with villains, but with reasonable people making slightly wrong assumptions. So here's the real question. Bigger than contracts, bigger than revenue splits, bigger than this negotiation itself. Is the WNBA ready to protect its future? Or is it already spending it? Because growth windows don't stay open forever. And history is unforgiving to leagues that mistake momentum for security. If you want to stay ahead of what's really happening behind the scenes in women's basketball, the power shifts, the negotiations, the stories they won't say out loud, make sure you're subscribed. Drop your take in the comments, because this conversation isn't over. And trust me, what comes next will define the league for years.